So, hello there. I'm going to be going over some killer JavaScript interview questions. Now, these are going to be some questions that don't require a shared screen answer that might require coding, but rather a verbal conversation, a verbal technical interview. So, let's get started. So what's the difference between Java and JavaScript? This is a crazy one because I don't know if you have had this experience, but I have often encountered situations where a recruiter, especially a recruiter, doesn't know the difference between Java and JavaScript. And I've even ended up in interviews at least twice where it was a wrong interview, where the recruiter thought it was the same thing. And I end up in an interview for a position that is supposed to be for Java, but I was told it was for JavaScript. So yeah, it's a little bit crazy. So as programmers, we know that they are totally different. Java was created by Sun Microsystems. JavaScript was created by Netscape. Java was created to run on operating systems. JavaScript was created to run in a browser on a V8 runtime engine. Java requires a compiler. JavaScript is directly interpreted and sometimes transpiled. I did make a video about a year ago about the history of JavaScript and how it all started. I'll put a link in the description below for that. But let's get back to these interview questions. Java is an object-oriented programming language. JavaScript is functional-based. However, there can be different styles in which we actually choose to program. For example, organizing code into units could be considered object-oriented programming. Avoiding side effects could be called functional programming. That's a very brief explanation, but if you were to describe an object-oriented programming language, you'd have to say that it should support polymorphism, and that is the provision of a single interface to entities of different types, or the use of a single symbol to represent multiple different types. And it would also be capable of encapsulation and inheritance. JavaScript can do all of this, but when it comes to inheritance, it does this via prototyping. However, this is done at the expense of encapsulation. I can make a video dedicated to this at some point, but in fact, I've heard people say that it's a prototypal language, if that's a real word. But if they say that, I know what they're getting at. But basically, you need to know all of this in case it comes up in an interview, or if you just want to appear smart in front of your friends. But I like to say that prior to making this video, I was browsing around through other videos of people talking about JavaScript interview questions and so on. And I saw two different people say that Java is an object-oriented programming language and JavaScript is object-oriented based. So object-oriented versus object-based, which I don't know if that should be like the correct answer because oriented and based are more like synonyms of each other. You know, like I have a friend who plays in a band and his music is more rock and roll based, or his music is rock and roll oriented. It's almost like it means the same thing. So if you say that in an interview, I don't know, I mean, you could get into trouble. There's a little bit of trouble. Like if I was the interviewer asking that question and somebody told me that, I would like to dig a little bit deeper to see what they're getting at. So if you're in an interview and you say something like that, you're going to want to know a little bit more so you can actually back that up. But I would just go on and talk about the inheritance, the prototyping, encapsulation, the polymorphism, and so on, just to have a more detailed answer. And then the next question on my list is what data types are supported in JavaScript? So that will be null, undefined, number, big int. Big int is something that I don't even know if it's used that much. I know that I have used that in my older days when I was actually programming in Java, not JavaScript. But I don't know if I've ever come across an application where I needed to use big int. But that's one of them if you want to remember it and just remember for an interview. Then of course there's string and object. Next, what are some benefits of JavaScript? Very reactive. Provides for user interaction. Efficiency. No need to reload pages, of course. It's very fast. Web apps become easier to use. It's easier with tons of development tools, libraries, and frameworks. Then, what is Babel? Some people say Babel. I say Babel. But it's a transpiler that transpiles your code to a different version of JavaScript. So for example, transforms ES6 to ES5 so that older browsers can interpret the code better. Then how do you create an object? What's JSON? Right, so JavaScript object notation is JSON. If you want to describe an object to them, you have to say that you open and close with braces. The object itself is sort of like name value pairs. It gets an attribute and it gets a value. The values can be strings, or it could be numbers, or it could even be a function. What are some common built-in functions in JavaScript? And there are quite a few, but if you want to know some common ones, or if you want to memorize some common ones for your interview, you can say things like is not a number, so NaN, not a number, parse int, parse float, right? Changing a string to an int or changing it to a float, round, length, concat, all just some very common functions. Name the type of scopes in JavaScript. Well, this one is, there's basically two types of scopes. There's global scope that will be seen pretty much everywhere across the application globally. And then there's local scope. So JavaScript is more like a block scope programming language where you have a scope, maybe let's say inside of a function. So that's a local scope, local to that function. And then outside of that function in the outer scope, the outer scope, is the global scope. And what is the this keyword used for? Well, it's used for referring to the object currently being called, right? This object. And it's most commonly used in constructors to assign values. And what's the difference between var, let, and const? Oh, var gets hoisted. Let and const are new as of ES6 and never get hoisted. So basically what that means, when the program runs, the variable just gets pulled straight up to the top. It's funny because as a Transformers fan, as far back as the 80s, I remember there was a Transformer that had a crane on top of him, and his name was Hoist. So I guess pulling things up. So that's what every time I think of hoist in JavaScript, I think of that. So, but basically one thing you want to get straight is that you can't say that the variable will just get pulled straight up to the top. You have to be a little bit more specific because again, JavaScript is block scoped, right? So let's say you're inside of a function, the hoisting that will occur inside of the function is that it will just go straight up to the top of that function, right? It won't go straight up to the top of the actual file. And this basically leads us into the next slide where I just described what is hoisting, but where it can get a little bit tricky here. Hoisting works a little bit differently for function declarations and function expressions, right? So if we call the function foo before any of the following, in the first case, the function declaration, function foo, everything will just be fine because the actual function in the function declaration is hoisted to the top. Even if it's after you call it in the code, it'll get hoisted straight up to the top and your program will run just fine. But in a function expression, it's a little bit different. So the second bullet point I have here, which is the first function expression, I have const foo is equal to function. Now, the reason why this one won't get hoisted is because it's a const. As in the previous slide, a const will not get hoisted. But in my final example here, we have a function expression where we have var foo is equal to function. Now, we do know that a var will get hoisted. However, your program will still throw an error if you call the function before this function expression. The reason why is that even though the var is hoisted all the way to the top, only its declaration has been hoisted. But it would appear undefined at the time that you call the foo function. The program does not yet know anything about the assignment of the function to the variable foo. Now, what's a callback? So basically the way you want to describe that is that it's a function that we're passing to another function, so you're waiting for it to perform its task and return back to you. And the most common example of a callback is here, set timeout. So we're calling set timeout and we're passing in another function. And what happens there, we console.log aloha, and then that gets returned, and then this finishes, right? So 500 milliseconds. All right, so that's it for now. And there's probably like 100 other common JavaScript questions that might be asked in an interview. So we had 11 of them here. And if you get into an interview, the interviewer might ask you verbally, let's say they might ask you 10 different questions, but maybe 2 or 3 of them will only appear on this list, and there might be others. So in the future, I'm going to make a few more of these videos. So let's say 10 more questions per video, more or less. So subscribe to my channel and look out for those.